light.
Hollywood has spent billions of dollars trying to imagine the end of the world, but the most disturbing, the most brilliant, and the most unforgettable visions of their human extinction spectacle were never the ones that made it onto your radar. They were buried, shelved, released into empty theaters, and abandoned by studios who had no idea what they were sitting on. And here's the unbelievable part. These aren't the polished, sanitized apocalypses you've been fed by Marvel or the latest streaming algorithm. These are raw, dangerous, forgotten pieces of cinema that were too strange, too provocative, or just too far ahead of their time to survive first contact with audiences who simply were not ready. From underground European productions that make Mad Max look like a theme park ride, to a zero-budget American indie that accidentally launched an entire subgenre, these 15 films rewrote the rules of post-apocalyptic storytelling, and the world completely forgot they existed. Number 15. Battle Truck, 1982. Before Peter Jackson ever touched a camera, a scrappy little post-apocalyptic movie was being shot across the plains of central Otago, New Zealand, under the banner of a company that would eventually become Wingnut Films. That company would go on to produce the Lord of the Rings trilogy. But in 1982, its very first production credit belonged to Battle Truck. The budget was roughly $400,000 US, a fraction of what Mad Max 2 cost the same year at $3 million. But here is what makes the film genuinely remarkable. What Harley Cokeliss and his team achieved on that budget defies logic. The movie starred Michael Beck, a man who just 3 years earlier had been one of the hottest rising talents in Hollywood after leading Walter Hill's cult classic in 1979. Then he signed on to Xanadu alongside Olivia Newton-John in 1980, and his trajectory shattered overnight. Beck himself put it bluntly. He said, "The Warriors opened a lot of doors for him, but by the time he arrived in New Zealand to play the lone motorcycle-riding hero of Battle Truck, his mainstream career was already in freefall." And here is where the story gets fascinating. The man behind the camera was cinematographer Chris Menges. The boom operator on set was Lee Tamahori, and buried even deeper in the credits, the gaffer was Stuart Dryborough. 3 future legends, all cutting their teeth on a low-budget wasteland movie that grossed roughly $3 million at the North American box office. Battle Truck didn't fail because it was bad. It failed because it arrived in the shadow of Mad Max 2 and never had the marketing muscle to compete. Number 14. The New Barbarians, 1983. In the early 1980s, the Italian film industry was running one of the most aggressive copycat operations in cinema history. If a movie made money anywhere on the planet, Rome would have a knockoff in production within months. And nobody played that game harder or with more flair than director Enzo G. Castellari. By 1983, Castellari was already a cult legend. But before any of that happened, Castellari was churning out post-apocalyptic action films on budgets so small, he later admitted with pride that The New Barbarians was an extremely cheap movie, but that he was proud he succeeded in making it shot entirely on the outskirts of Rome. The plot was simple. Set in the year 2019 after a nuclear holocaust, 2 warriors protect a band of survivors from a genocidal biker gang called the Templars. During productions, the stunt performers earned their money, flipping vehicles and taking falls that looked genuinely painful. To compensate for the paper-thin budget, Castellari filmed every stunt sequence at 3 different frame rates, shooting at 24, 55, and 96 frames per second, then intercutting the footage in the editing room to make the action feel faster and more violent than it actually was. Number 13. Ravagers, 1979. Columbia Pictures spent $4 million in 1979 trying to build a post-apocalyptic epic around one of the most decorated casts ever assembled for a genre film. And then they buried it so completely that it didn't receive a home video release for decades. Ravagers was directed by Richard Compton, and it came with a cast assembled as if someone had raided every respectable corner of American character acting. Richard Harris, Ernest Borgnine, Art Carney, Woody Strode, and Seymour Cassell, plus Anthony James, the quintessential screen psychotic. On paper, this is a film that should not be forgotten. In practice, it became one of the most thoroughly buried studio genre pictures of the decade. The film was based on Robert Edmond Alter's 1966 novel, Path to Savagery, and shot almost entirely on location in Alabama, using Birmingham's Sloss furnaces as its apocalyptic backdrop and the U.S. Space and Rocket Center in Huntsville as a decayed missile base. Behind the scenes, the production even recycled a matte painting originally created for 1970's Beneath the Planet of the Apes to establish its destroyed cityscape in the opening titles. But Ravagers hit theaters in May 1979 and immediately drowned. Columbia Pictures gave it a limited rollout with almost no promotion. Number 12. Where Have All the People Gone? 1974. In 1972, a British director named John Llewellyn Moxey made a little television film called The Night Stalker. It became the highest-rated TV movie in American broadcast history at the time and launched an entire franchise. 2 years later, that same director turned his attention to the end of the world, and almost nobody noticed. Where Have All the People Gone? Aired on NBC on October 8, 1974, and it did something that very few apocalypse stories had ever attempted on a television budget. It made the catastrophe invisible. There are no mushroom clouds, no alien invasions, no collapsing cities. Instead, a series of massive solar flares silently reduces most of the human population to a fine white powder, leaving behind nothing but piles of empty clothing. And here's the interesting part. Originally, the film was conceived and designed as a pilot for a potential ongoing television series, which was ultimately never developed. That failure to launch is part of what makes this film so haunting in retrospect. Number 11. Radioactive Dreams, 1984. When Albert Pyun was still a teenager in Hawaii, the legendary Japanese actor Toshiro Mifune saw one of his student short films and was so impressed that he invited the young filmmaker to Japan to serve as an intern on an upcoming Akira Kurosawa production. Unfortunately, that internship didn't go as planned, but Pyun ended up working alongside Kurosawa's regular cinematographer, Takao Saito, and the education he received there shaped everything that came after. By 1982, Pyun had directed his debut feature. Hollywood took notice. And then Pyun did something that no studio expected. Instead of cashing in with a safe follow-up, he spent his newfound credibility on one of the strangest post-apocalyptic films ever conceived. Behind the scenes, the Radioactive Dreams sequence was shot in Hawaii and Mexico, beginning in March 1984, on a budget of $3 million. The premise is pure madness. Two boys are locked inside a fallout shelter as children during a nuclear war, and spend the next 15 years reading nothing but hard-boiled detective novels from the 1940s. Pyun named his protagonists Philip Chandler and Marlo Hammer as direct tributes to Raymond Chandler and Dashiell Hammett, and he dressed them in period-accurate 1940s clothing, while every other character in the film is draped in punk, mutant, or tribal post-apocalyptic costuming. The supporting cast included George Kennedy and Lisa Blount. The score was a pulsating synth-driven creation, and the film ends with a song and dance number that feels like it belongs in a completely different movie. Unfortunately, the De Laurentiis Entertainment Group picked it up for distribution, but gave it a limited theatrical release in September 1986, where it grossed just $220,000. Number 10. The Ultimate Warrior, 1975. The director of Enter the Dragon once made a post-apocalyptic movie starring two of the most commanding screen presences of the 20th century. It made more than 11 times its budget, and virtually nobody alive today has seen it. The Ultimate Warrior was directed by Robert Klaus, written by Klaus himself, and distributed by Warner Brothers with a budget of $800,000. It starred Yul Brynner and Max von Sydow. That combination of names for that amount of money tells you something about how much each man chose to invest in the project versus what they were paid. During production, the film was shot almost entirely on the Universal backlot, with production designers transforming the standing sets into crumbling, overgrown cityscapes on a shoestring. And behind the scenes, one of the most important figures in modern film history was quietly cutting the footage together. The economics here are fascinating. There was no location shoot. Almost everything was captured on the Warner Brothers backlot streets, dressed and distressed into ruin. On set, wide shots of devastation were achieved with still photographs. Art director Walter M. Simmons and set decorator William F. Calvert stretched that budget until it produced something genuinely textured. When The Ultimate Warrior opened, it grossed around $9 million. Number 9. Damnation Alley, 1977. In 1977, 20th Century Fox had two science fiction films on its release schedule. One was a modestly budgeted space adventure from a young director that studio executives considered a risky gamble. The other was a $17 million post-apocalyptic epic based on a celebrated novel by Roger Zelazny, directed by Jack Smite, who had just delivered back-to-back box office hits with Airport, 1975, and Midway. Fox was absolutely certain which film was going to be their blockbuster. They chose Damnation Alley. The other film was Star Wars. And here's the thing. The production of Damnation Alley had been in development for 8 years. Fox poured money into the project, including $350,000 just to build the Landmaster, a 12-wheeled, 35-foot amphibious vehicle constructed by legendary custom car builder Dean Jeffries that remains one of the most impressive practical vehicles ever created for a movie. In fact, Fox even developed a proprietary sound system called Sound 360 specifically for the film's theatrical premiere, designed to make the seats vibrate. But when Star Wars started running over budget, Fox reportedly diverted funds away from Damnation Alley to keep George Lucas's project alive. Planned effect sequences were scrapped, stock footage was substituted. Eventually, director Smite lost creative control as the studio panicked and re-edited the entire film to emphasize the Landmaster and action sequences over character development. By the time Damnation Alley finally opened in October 1977, Star Wars had been in theaters for 5 months and had already grossed over $200 million. Damnation Alley made around $9 million. Number 8. The Last Man on Earth, 1964. The Last Man on Earth was the first screen adaptation of Richard Matheson's landmark 1954 novel, I Am Legend, and the story behind how it got made is almost as tortured as the film itself. Before productions, Hammer Films originally purchased the rights to the novel in the late 1950s, and Matheson wrote the screenplay. But British censors refused to allow the production to move forward, deeming it too graphic. The rights were then sold to American producer Robert L. Lippert, who at one point considered hiring the legendary Fritz Lang to direct the film under the title Naked Terror. That never materialized either. What finally emerged was a joint American-Italian production shot in Rome's EUR district, with Vincent Price cast as the last surviving human in a world overrun by plague-infected creatures who behave like vampires. And here's the thing. When the film opened, Matheson was so dissatisfied with the final screenplay that he removed his name from the credits entirely and used the pseudonym Logan Swanson. Price, on the other hand, had a genuine fondness for the film and later said he believed it was superior to The Omega Man. The Last Man on Earth was released as a bottom half of a double feature. It made almost no money. Number 7. Defcon 4, 1985. In October 1983, a small Canadian production company called Salter Street Films started shooting a post-apocalyptic movie in Halifax, Nova Scotia on a budget of $800,000. 2 weeks into the 8-week schedule, production shut down completely, and in interviews, director Paul Donovan later described a mess of overlapping problems. The script needed rewriting, the technical execution wasn't working, even the Canadian autumn landscape wasn't cooperating with the visual tone they were trying to achieve. They paused, regrouped, rewrote, and started again. The result was Defcon 4, a film that opens with one of the most genuinely unsettling setups of any 1980s science fiction movie.
Where's help? Find them!
The premise was everything. 3 American astronauts are orbiting Earth aboard a military satellite designed to launch nuclear missiles at Russia if World War III begins. Behind the scenes, the VHS cover art, a stunning painted illustration of a spacecraft crashing toward a nuclear wasteland, was so visually striking that the film became a sensation in video rental stores. By the summer of 1986, Defcon 4 had grossed over $5.5 million, becoming one of New World Pictures' top-selling VHS titles. Number 6. A Boy and His Dog, 1975. A Boy and His Dog was directed by L.Q. Jones. At the time, Jones had never helmed anything close to this scale before. The film stars a young, completely unknown Don Johnson as Vic, an 18-year-old scavenger roaming the post-nuclear wasteland of 2024 with a telepathic dog named Blood, who is smarter, funnier, and more morally aware than his human companion. The voice of Blood was performed by Tim McIntyre, chosen from roughly 600 auditions. Behind the scenes, Jones spent 3 full months writing the film's final line alone, a single sentence so controversial that he shot an alternate ending just in case. And here's the interesting part. Throughout the film, the contrast is the entire design. Above ground there is dust, rape, hunger, and honesty. Below ground in Topeka, there is a lethal parody of small-town America, marching bands, and pancake white makeup and painted cheeks, all of it polite, and all of it murderous. When A Boy and His Dog premiered, it earned roughly $4 million domestically. Number 5. Panic in Year Zero, 1962. 3 months before the Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world to the genuine brink of nuclear annihilation, American International Pictures released a $225,000 film about a family watching Los Angeles get vaporized in their rearview mirror. The timing was either prophetic or catastrophic, depending on who you ask.
Okay, now, easy.
Panic in Year Zero was directed by and starred Ray Milland. Behind the scenes, Milland played a father who takes his wife and 2 children on a fishing trip, and while they are driving through the hills above Los Angeles, nuclear bombs detonate behind them. His teenage son was played by Frankie Avalon, in one of the most jarring casting choices of the era, yet it works precisely because Avalon's wholesome public image makes the violence and moral collapse around him feel even more disturbing. AIP shot the entire film in just 2 weeks on a shoestring budget, using Los Angeles backlots and nearby California locations. And here's the thing. On set, Milland was restless. In fact, Roger Corman later said bluntly that Milland was overwhelmed, that he was not organized enough to act and direct simultaneously. It was so bad that sometimes he lost time and forgot his own scenes. Number 4. The Quiet Earth, 1985. The Quiet Earth was produced for roughly $3 million, starred an actor who also co-wrote the screenplay, and was described by the Los Angeles Daily News as quite simply the best science fiction film of the 1980s. But almost nobody outside of New Zealand ever saw it. The film was based on Craig Harrison's 1981 novel and adapted by Bruno Lawrence alongside director Murphy and producer Sam Pillsbury. Before filming, Murphy and Lawrence had been creative partners for years. To achieve the illusion of a depopulated world on a shoestring, the crew filmed in Auckland and Hamilton during the earliest hours of the morning, and an assistant director spent every single take staring at the edges of the frame to make sure no cars or pedestrians wandered into the background. Despite the extreme care, at least 2 shots in the finished film contain distant vehicles that slipped through. The first act of the movie is essentially a one-man show, and Lawrence delivers one of the most committed performances in science fiction history. Then there is the iconic ending. The final image of The Quiet Earth is one of the most debated shots in the history of the genre. A single frame so visually stunning and so deliberately ambiguous that audiences have been arguing about its meaning for 4 decades. Murphy never explained it. Lawrence never explained it. Producer Pillsbury offered only the cryptic suggestion that it might have something to do with purgatory. Number 3. Testament, 1983. Testament was never supposed to reach cinemas. Initially, it was commissioned as a 60-minute television film for the PBS series American Playhouse, funded with $500,000 and the promise of no interference. Then the script came back at 90 minutes. Everyone agreed it was too good to cut, and the budget stretched to $750,000. That is the entire financial machinery behind one of the most devastating films ever made about nuclear war. What separates Testament from every other nuclear film of its era is what it refuses to show. There is no mushroom cloud, no military response, no special effects. The bomb goes off somewhere off-screen, and the rest of the film is simply a mother trying to hold her family together as radiation sickness slowly takes them, one by one. One scene in particular, where Alexander silently sews a shroud for one of her own children, contains no dialogue and almost no movement, and it is among the most harrowing sequences in American cinema. Despite all these, Testament opened and grossed just $2 million at the box office. Number 2. The Omega Man, 1971. Charlton Heston read a novel during a flight from London to Los Angeles, and by the time the plane landed, he had decided he was going to turn it into a movie. The novel was Richard Matheson's I Am Legend, and Heston didn't even realize it had already been adapted once before as The Last Man on Earth with Vincent Price in 1964. After screening the earlier film, Heston dismissed it in his autobiography as a pretty torpid piece and convinced Warner Brothers to move forward with a new version. The result was The Omega Man, directed by Boris Sagal on location throughout Los Angeles in late 1970. To create the illusion of a depopulated city without CGI or digital effects, the crew filmed downtown Los Angeles exclusively on Sunday mornings, when the business district was virtually deserted. Despite careful planning, some exterior shots captured bystanders and moving cars in the background, but the effect was still powerful enough to establish one of the most iconic images of urban desolation in cinema history. And here's what most people never knew. In Heston's autobiography, he wrote that Cash was understandably nervous about their love scene. He recalled her telling him it was a spooky feeling to screw Moses. Even the film's most famous visual moment, a crucifixion-like death scene, was not in the original screenplay. It was conceived on set and left in because it fit so perfectly with the story's themes of sacrifice and renewal. When The Omega Man opened, it earned roughly $4 million in domestic rentals. Number 1. Miracle Mile, 1988. The script for Miracle Mile had been sitting in Hollywood for nearly a decade. In fact, in 1983, American Film Magazine named it one of the 10 best unproduced screenplays in Hollywood. Studios wanted it. The directors wanted it. At one point, Nicolas Cage was attached to star. Kurt Russell was also attached at different points. Warner Brothers put it into development and spent years trying to figure out how to make it bigger, louder, and more commercial. And then the writer, a man named Steve DeJarnette, did something almost unheard of in Hollywood.
Now! Now! Now spread your arms and legs. Spread.
He bought his own screenplay back for $25,000. Warner Brothers offered him $400,000 to sell it back. He refused. He would make the film himself, on his own terms, with his own ending. The result was Miracle Mile, a movie that unfolds in real time across a single Los Angeles night. Everything about this movie is terrific. Behind the scenes, Anthony Edwards plays a jazz musician who picks up a ringing payphone outside a diner at 4 in the morning and hears a panicked voice on the other end saying that nuclear war has started and missiles will hit the city in roughly 70 minutes. Tangerine Dream composed the score after DeJarnette wrote the script. The Hemdale Film Corporation financed it for approximately $3.7 million, and after principal photography wrapped, DeJarnette spent $150,000 of his own money filming additional pickup shots with Edwards and Mayor Winningham. Unfortunately, when Miracle Mile premiered, it grossed just $1.1 million. If this list opened your eyes to even one film you had never heard of, do us a favor. Share this video with someone who needs to see it. And if you haven't already, subscribe, because we have a lot more. Forgotten cinema to uncover. See you in the next video.